You don't wake up one day and decide to be a mercenary. It's not a childhood dream. It's an endpoint. It's what happens when all other doors close. For most men, life was a set path. If you were born a farmer, you farmed. If your father was a blacksmith, you learned to work the forge. Your world was your village, and your life was tied to the land and the local lord. But sometimes that path crumbled, maybe the harvest failed again, not just a bad year, but a string of them. The rain didn't come, or it came all at once and washed the seeds away. The Lord still wanted his taxes. The priest still wanted his tithe. Your family was starving. You looked at your hands, calloused from the plow, and knew they couldn't pull food from barren dirt. But they could hold a spear. Out on the road, there were stories of men who fought for coin. They ate every day. It was a dangerous choice, but starving was a slow, certain death. So you walked away from the only life you knew, or maybe you were a second son, or a third, or a fourth. Your older brother got everything: the land, the title, the castle. That was the law. You were trained to fight, to ride a horse, to command men. You were a nobleman, but you owned nothing. You had the skills of a warrior, but no war to fight for your own king. Your choices were the church or a life of dependence on your brother's charity. Neither sounded good, but a mercenary captain didn't care about your birthright. He cared if you could lead a cavalry charge. He paid for that skill. It was a way to make your own fortune, to build a name for yourself with your own sword. Sometimes war itself created the mercenary. A king raises an army to fight a long war. You serve for years, you learn how to march, how to make camp, how to kill. Fighting becomes your trade. Then the war ends. A treaty is signed. The king thanks you for your service and sends you home. But home isn't there anymore. Your village was burned, your family is gone, and you have no other skill. The king who trained you to be a soldier no longer wants you. But there's always another war, somewhere. A city-state needs men to defend its walls. A duke wants to seize his neighbor's land. Your skills are still in demand, just not by the man you once served, so you find a new paymaster. Your loyalty shifts from a flag to a contract, and then there were the outcasts. The criminals, the exiles, the men who had burned their bridges. A man who killed another in a tavern brawl couldn't go back to his town. A poacher caught on a lord's land might lose a hand, or his life. Running away was the only option. Joining a mercenary company was like disappearing. They didn't ask about your past. They gave you a new identity, soldier. Your crimes were washed away by the violence of your new life. In a company of killers and thieves, you were just one of the pack. These men came from all over. They were Englishmen who fought in France, Germans who fought in Italy, Swiss who fought for anyone who could pay their high price. They formed companies, brotherhoods of circumstance. They were the White Company, the Great Company, the Company of the Hat. Their names were meant to sound intimidating. They were a business, and their business was war. They weren't fighting for God or for a nation. They fought for silver. They were the sharp, bloody edge of a changing world, where gold was becoming more powerful than oaths of loyalty. Life as a mercenary began where other lives ended. It was a desperate gamble, a new beginning forged in violence. A mercenary company was not just a mob of armed men, it was a business, and the man who ran it was the captain. The captain was an entrepreneur. He was often a minor noble, a skilled veteran, or just a man with a talent for violence and leadership. He was the one who found the work, negotiated the price, and kept his men in line. His reputation was everything. If he was known as a good commander who won battles and paid on time, men would flock to his banner. If he was known for losing or for cheating his men, he'd soon find himself alone and likely with a knife in his back. The heart of the business was the contract. In Italy, it was called a condotta. This was a detailed legal document. It wasn't a handshake deal. It laid everything out in plain terms. It specified how many men the captain had to provide: so many knights in full armor, so many crossbowmen, so many foot soldiers with spears. It set the length of service, usually a period of a few months. And most importantly, it stated the pay. One payment was the fuel that made the whole machine run. It was broken down by rank. A knight, with his expensive horse and armor, earned far more than a simple foot soldier. An archer, a skilled specialist, earned more than a spearman. The contract would state the exact amount, the type of coin, and when it would be paid, usually monthly. It might also include clauses for bonuses, like extra pay for capturing a city or winning a decisive battle. It even covered things like equipment, repair, and ransom money. If a soldier was captured, the company might be obligated to pay for his release. But getting the money was often the hardest part of the job. Employers were always looking for ways to cut costs. They might try to pay in debased currency, coins mixed with less valuable metals. Or they would just be late. A late payment was dangerous. It bred dissent. The men hadn't joined for glory. They were there for the silver. If the silver didn't come, their loyalty vanished. When the pay was late, a captain had a few options. He could threaten his employer. He could refuse to fight a battle until the chests of coin arrived. This was a risky game. It could get you a reputation for being unreliable. A more common tactic was to let the men take their payment from the local countryside. This was called living off the land, but it was really just organized robbery. The company would plunder villages, steal livestock, and burn fields. It sent a clear message to their employer: pay us, or we will ruin your lands and your people. Sometimes, if an employer was particularly untrustworthy, a mercenary company would switch sides in the middle of a war. They would go to the enemy and offer their services for a better price. In this business, loyalty was a commodity. Inside the company, there was a clear structure. The captain was at the top. Beneath him were lieutenants who commanded smaller units. There were standard bearers who carried the company's flag into battle. This was a position of great honor. There was a treasurer or a clerk who kept track of the payroll. There were constables who enforced discipline. A man caught stealing from a comrade might be flogged or hanged. The company had to have order to function, especially in the chaos of a campaign. The loot was a huge part of the mercenary economy. After a battle or the sacking of a town, anything of value was collected. Gold, silver, weapons, armor, livestock. The contract usually specified how the loot would be divided. The captain got the largest share. The rest was split among the men according to their rank. This promise of plunder was a powerful motivator. It was a chance to get rich quick, a jackpot that made all the marching and killing worthwhile. The business of war was brutal and direct. It turned skill with a sword into a pile of coin. It was a profession built on written contracts and enforced with steel. The life of a mercenary is often imagined as constant fighting. The reality was very different. Most of his time was spent not in battle, but in waiting. It was a life of endless marching and long, boring weeks in camp, and this part of the life was often more dangerous than any fight. The march was a grueling ordeal. A soldier carried everything he owned on his back. His weapon, a small amount of armor, a bedroll, a cooking pot, a water skin. The company moved on foot day after day in all weather. The roads were often just muddy tracks. In summer, it was dust and heat. In winter, it was freezing rain and snow. Their boots wore out. Feet bled. Men got sick. The pace was relentless. A company that moved too slow might miss a battle or get caught by an enemy. When the company wasn't on the move, it made camp. A mercenary camp was not a neat, orderly place. It was a sprawling, chaotic, temporary city. It was a city of tents and lean taws, of campfires and horse lines. It smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, cooking food, and waste. There was no sanitation. Men relieved themselves where they could. This filth was a breeding ground for disease. Disease killed more soldiers than swords ever did. Dysentery, which they called the bloody flux, could sweep through a camp and kill dozens. Typhus, spread by lice, was another common killer. A small cut could become infected and lead to a slow, agonizing death. There were doctors, but their knowledge was limited. They could set a broken bone or stitch a wound, but they had no answer for the sicknesses that spread invisibly through the camp. A man could survive a dozen battles, only to die of a fever in a wet, cold tent. Boredom was a constant enemy. To fight it, men gambled. They played dice games for coins, for equipment, for their next meal. These games often led to arguments and fights. Drinking was another pastime. Wine and ale were cheap and plentiful. Drunkenness was common. It was a way to forget the misery and fear of their daily lives. But it also led to brawls that could turn deadly. The company's officers had to be ruthless in maintaining discipline, or the camp would tear itself apart. Floggings were a common punishment. Hangings were not unheard of for serious offenses like murder or mutiny. The camp was not just made up of soldiers, it was a whole community on the move. These were the camp followers. Many were women, some were the wives or partners of the soldiers. They cooked the meals, washed the clothes, and mended equipment. They provided a small piece of normal life in a brutal world. Other women were prostitutes, following the army to make a living. There were also merchants, called sutlers, who sold supplies that the army didn't provide: better food, stronger wine, new boots, gambling dice. There were blacksmiths to shoe horses and repair armor, leather workers, and carpenters. And children were born and raised in these camps. It was the only life they ever knew. Food was a constant obsession. The company was supposed to be supplied by its employer, but this rarely worked well. More often, the mercenaries had to forage for themselves. Foraging was a nice word for taking what they needed from the local people. A foraging party was a band of armed men sent out to strip the countryside. They would take grain from farmers, slaughter their livestock, and empty their cellars of wine and ale. They rarely met resistance. A peasant with a pitchfork was no match for a group of professional soldiers. This was why mercenaries were so feared by ordinary people. An army passing through your lands was like a plague of locusts. It consumed everything and left destruction behind. This was the brutal reality of a mercenary's life between the battles. It was a life of hardship, filth, boredom, and casual cruelty, a daily struggle for survival long before the enemy was even in sight. The waiting is over. The scouts have reported the enemy's position. The captain has given his orders. This is the day the mercenary earns his pay. The morning of a battle is a strange mix of routine and terror. A man wakes in the cold dawn. He eats whatever food he has, knowing it might be his last meal. He checks his equipment, he sharpens the edge of his sword or polishes the point of his spear. He makes sure the straps on his helmet and armor are secure. This is his ritual. These small familiar tasks help to keep the fear at bay. Then the company forms up. The men move into their positions. The spearmen create a dense hedge of points. The crossbowmen stand behind them, ready to unleash a storm of bolts. The knights mount their heavy war horses on the flanks. The standard bearer raises the company's flag. It's a rallying point, a symbol of their unity in the chaos to come. The captain rides along the lines, shouting words of encouragement. He doesn't speak of patriotism or glory, he speaks of coin and loot. He reminds them of the wealth in the enemy camp, of the ransom they can get for noble prisoners. He is reminding them why they are about to risk their lives. The battle begins not with a heroic charge, but with a lot of noise. The sound is overwhelming, the braying of trumpets, the pounding of drums, the shouting of orders. Then comes the sound of the first volleys, the hiss of arrows, the thrum of crossbows. Men scream and fall before the armies have even touched. For the mercenary on the front line, the world shrinks. It becomes nothing more than the man in front of him. He sees the enemy's faces, their eyes wide with the same fear he feels. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and churned up earth. The noise is a constant roar, steel on steel, the splintering of wooden shields, the screams of the wounded and dying. A mercenary's approach to combat was different from that of a feudal knight. He was not there to prove his honor or to die for a cause. He was there to do a job and survive to collect his pay. This made him a practical, professional fighter. Mercenaries didn't take unnecessary risks. They preferred a strong defensive position, letting the enemy waste their energy attacking a wall of spears. They were disciplined, they held the line. A single man breaking and running could cause a panic that would destroy the entire formation. Their goal was to break the enemy's will to fight. Once the enemy line wavered, that was the moment to attack. The disciplined push of a pike block or a well-timed cavalry charge could turn a wavering line into a full-blown rout. And the rout was where the real killing happened. Men fleeing for their lives were easy targets. But killing was not always the most profitable outcome. A wealthy knight or a noble was worth far more alive than dead. Capturing one for ransom could make a soldier rich, so mercenaries learned to identify the valuable targets. They looked for the men with the finest armor, the most decorated shields. They would try to surround them, knock them off their horse, and force them to surrender. A dead enemy was just a corpse to be looted for his armor. A live one was a walking chest of gold. After the battle, the work was not done. The field had to be cleared. The mercenaries walked among the dead and dying. They stripped the bodies of anything valuable, weapons, armor, coins, even clothing. They would kill the wounded enemy soldiers to put them out of their misery, or simply to take their boots. Their own wounded were gathered up and taken back to camp. A surgeon would try to patch them up. He would pull arrows out, stitch gaping wounds with a needle and thread, and saw off shattered limbs. Many died from infection days later. The day's bloody work ended around the campfires. The men counted their loot and their ransoms, they drank to the dead and to their own survival. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally. They had faced death and survived. They had done their job. The pay was earned, but they knew another battle, another day, just like this one, was never far away. A mercenary's career never ended with a quiet retirement party. There was no pension, no letter of thanks from a grateful king. The end of the road came in many forms, and most of them were grim. For the vast majority, the final payment was death. Many died in the heat of battle. A stray arrow, a spear thrust, a sword cut. It could be over in an instant. They fell on a foreign field, fighting for a cause they didn't believe in, and were buried in a mass grave or left for the crows. Their names were forgotten. They were just another body on the pile. Even more men died away from the battlefield. They died of disease in a filthy camp. They died from a small wound that festered and poisoned their blood. They died of starvation during a long siege or froze to death on a winter march. This was the slow, anonymous death that claimed most of them. It was a miserable end, far from the clash of steel they might have imagined. Some met their end through betrayal. A mercenary company was a powerful tool, but a dangerous one. When a war was over, an employer might find himself with a large, expensive, and now useless army of professional killers in his territory. And it was sometimes cheaper and safer to eliminate them than to pay them their final wages. A company might be led into an ambush by their supposed allies. Their captain could be invited to a feast to celebrate a victory, only to be murdered along with his lieutenants. The leaderless company would then be easily scattered and destroyed. In the world of politics and power, a mercenary was ultimately disposable. But what about the survivors? What happened when the wars ended and the contracts dried up? For a mercenary, peace was a disaster. It meant unemployment. Some tried to return to a normal life. But it was hard to go back to pushing a plow after years of fighting and plunder. They were changed men. They were violent, restless, and accustomed to a life without rules. Many of them simply refused to stop being soldiers. They kept their companies together and became little more than bandits. They roamed the countryside, terrorizing it. They were called routiers or ecorture skinners because they stripped their victims of everything. They seized castles, set up their own little kingdoms of robbery, and demanded protection money from local towns. They became a plague upon the land, a problem that kings and nobles struggled to control. For these men, the war never ended. It just changed its name. A lucky few managed to beat the odds. A highly successful and clever captain could become incredibly wealthy and powerful. John Hawkwood, an Englishman who fought in Italy, was a perfect example. He was a brilliant commander and a shrewd politician. He played city-states against each other, switched sides when it suited him, and became one of the most feared and respected men in Italy. He was rewarded with land, a title, and a state funeral in the great cathedral of Florence. He was the exception. His story was the dream that every mercenary chased, but that almost none of them ever caught. The age of the classic mercenary company eventually began to fade. Kings and rulers started to realize they needed armies that were loyal to the state, not just to the highest bidder. They began to build national, standing armies, soldiers who were paid regularly by the government and who fought for their country. The development of gunpowder and cannons also changed warfare. The old skills of the knight and the spearman became less important. But the mercenary never truly disappeared. The idea of a soldier for hire, a professional who sells his skills in combat, endured. He was a product of his time, a man living in a gap between the old world of feudal loyalty and the new world of cash economies. His life was short, brutal, and driven by a simple, powerful need to get paid, to eat, to survive another day. For every famous captain whose name is remembered by history, there are thousands of forgotten men whose only legacy was the fear they inspired and the blood they shed on someone else's behalf. Their final payment was usually silence.